No shorty this evening? Gotcha. Good evening. Turn to Matthew 23. You already know this, though, because you were assigned to read this week. So I know everybody, in preparation for it. You're remembering right now, 167 hours ago, that you were told to do this. Matthew chapter 23. It's all right. I told you if you would to read it. You're going to read it again tonight anyway. So that's where, what's that? There you go. So we'll read it sort of broken down here this evening. But what Ben read just a few moments ago is the last three verses of Matthew chapter 23. And those last three verses sort of wrap up a whole chapter's worth of, well, we'll just pretty much say what it is, condemnation of the Pharisees, as we see there on the title. We looked last week at the first 12 verses of Matthew chapter 23. And just as a brief introduction, because we're going to get into the criticisms that Jesus puts forth here in just a few moments. But just as a reminder of what we talked about, Jesus will present 7 or 8, we'll talk about that here in just a second, woes to the Pharisees. And these woes or these criticisms or these condemnations, however you want to describe them, are all woes of hypocrisy. And we talked a bit about that last week, but they illustrate the difference between sort of the inner and the outer moral states, I guess is what I've got written up there. But how that in many cases, the Pharisees were really good at sort of making the outer look good, but the inner, which you couldn't see, was completely corrupt, was immoral, or maybe even amoral, and was just not what the religious leaders probably should have been. Jesus will portray them as being more focused on the outward rather than on the inward, more focused on ritual observance rather than the actual acts that they should have been doing. We've used the example of Jesus healing on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees were always quick to point that out. Not that they were not ready to give Jesus any credit for healing a person, which was a really great thing, but were rather able to point out why he should not have been healing on this specific date because this specific calendar said he should not, or whatever. And so for often, the inner person remained sort of unreformed, or it's breaking away, it's disintegrating for the Pharisees. And so I didn't want to get too much into what we had talked about last week because we had already done so, but I did want to at least refer back to that. Sure. Sure, absolutely. Absolutely so. All right, so we're going to look this evening at really Matthew 23, verses 13 all the way down through verse 36. Now I broke it down into 7 different woes. And the reason why is what I was reading is that in some versions of the Bible, Matthew 23 and verse 14 is not translated as woe unto you. It's kind of like a combo deal. So I've got those 2 put here. We can talk about them separately. It doesn't really matter. It's not going to affect what we talk about this evening, but we have 7 different sets. So if you're in Matthew chapter 23, you'll be good for the remainder of the evening, just to stay right there. Will, do you care to read first for us these first 2 verses? All right. Every set of verses will start the same way. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And so we will see that often in this. And so we're going to look at each one of these. I've got questions with each of these, and I encourage you to comment and make questions that you might have as well. Let's talk first about the kingdom of heaven that Jesus says. What had the scribes and Pharisees done to the kingdom of heaven in verse 13? You have shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. Now, I want to think about that verse for just a second, because that's a really strong statement to make. You have shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. Translate that for me to, that's probably not the way we would say it. So translate that for me, how we would say that today. That's kind of the way I interpret it as well. The idea that as a religious leader, you should be welcoming people to come in. You should be encouraging people to come in. But it's the total opposite, right? He said, you have shut this off. Other thoughts on it? Yeah. Yep. Yep. Right. Right. Sure. Sure. Yeah. And so you're turning people away in a sense. And the people that are coming in, you've made it so complicated. You've made it so difficult. You're ready to tisk anything that they're doing, not necessarily because there's a book, chapter, and verse, but because it's become ritualized, and we do not do this. I know we talked about this a couple times, but do you remember when we talked about the Sabbath day and the rules about the Sabbath day? But not the Bible rules, but the ritual rules. Like you could carry this certain amount, but they were like, it weighed more than, I can't even remember what it was by this point. But those rules were almost impossible to be able to follow. And so when you're trying to, if you want people to be part of your organization, if you complicate the rituals so much that they can't even grasp it, will they want to be part of that organization? It's going to be difficult, right? It's going to be complicated. And we'll get to that a little bit more in just a second. But I would hope that we would never be accused of shutting up the kingdom of heaven. That would be how could we shut up the kingdom of heaven today? Or how might, maybe I shouldn't say how could, how might we? Sure.
You slammed the door and locked it tight there.
Right.
How are they going to grow?
Right.
How are they going to survive? And that's an extreme example, I'm sure, but we can do the same thing. We don't really want that guy there. He's a little troublemaker. Sure. There are religious manuals that are printed in print, and we got to check these people out before we baptize them. We got to vote on them because we don't really want any riffraff.
Right.
There's dozens of ways we do it, whether it's living a hypocritical lifestyle that turns people off to the church, or going after someone and beating them over the head with the Bible. There's different ways we can turn people off where they don't want anything ever to do with the church, and it's because of us. That's what God's done, but because something that we've done is offended, or it's been way out of place of what a Christian should do.
Right.
We make rules, which are actually rules, not commandments in the Bible, and they're just like local rules, and you do this, and you do that. That's going to turn people off because you have no proof of that.
Right.
Trying to tell people what they need to do, you need to be able to go to the Bible and be able to put it
Sure.
not well, we feel this way.
Sure.
Because that's making us all suspicious.
Sure.
Good point to go on where she says, some churches that don't believe in giving, helping in it, no benevolence. You've got a woman loses her husband and her house in a fire. Oh, we can't help you. We're sorry, you're on your own.
Yes.
I mean, what's that going to do to the church, to her?
Right.
She's going to say, what
Well, and I think we could add to that then, those stories travel quickly. And in those situations, people don't just, box this stuff up and don't tell it. The example that you gave, that person's going to tell somebody else. The example that you gave, that they're going to, and not only that, you might have said no to one person, but that no to one person for your, ritual beliefs or local beliefs, it's like tentacles that'll spread to other people as well. Me? Absolutely. Sure. Yeah, I agree. Huh? Right. That's that is a positive then. And hopefully 100 years of good, I don't want to say paid off. That's not the right word, but that had been recognized by people. And they said, well, we would like for this organization, but that doesn't happen if you're doing what the Pharisees have done. If you're shutting it up, if you're closing it down, if you're saying no, 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 because I said so, not like mom said, because we read in Matthew or we read in Acts or we read in First, not a book, chapter, and verse. Those things don't happen. Yes. Yeah.
We can't take this because you are a sinner. Well, that's terrible. Yeah. Like I will never, ever, ever, ever come.
Right.
Because we're all sinners.
Play to be pretty empty. Right.
Free will. Give this to the church.
Right.
You can't take it because you're sinner. You kill any hope.
Sure. Absolutely.
It's terrible.
Let's go to the next one. This is Matthew 23. There's 7 of these, and so we won't spend a ton of time with each one. But Matthew 23 and verse 15. Annette, do you care to read this verse, please, dear? Yeah. Can we come back to you? All right. Linda, do you care to read this one while Annette's changing glasses back there? All right. Now, let me say, there are no positive statements tonight. Okay. So you're not going to, there's not going to be any one of these statements where you say, oh, Jesus, he seemed pretty chill on this. These are very strong criticisms. You ever known somebody that you worked with and they're about to retire and they just told you pretty much exactly how it was? Well, this is Jesus's last week on earth. And I feel like whatever level of sugarcoating there might have been in the build up to this, there is none of that happening here. Right. And so you're going to see in all of these, and the one we already read, this one, and the 5 more after this, that we don't see a whole lot of, sugarcoating on this. He mentions the words proselyte. First of all, what is a proselyte? Do we know? It's a convert. So the scribes and the Pharisees, it said they traveled land and sea to make one proselyte or one convert to the Jewish religion. But then what happens to the proselyte because of the influence of the scribes and Pharisees? The word that Jesus says is that you make him a son of hell. But Ben said right there is you make him worse than he'd been. And so that language that's used there, you travel land and sea. What does that mean? You're searching high and low. You're going everywhere. You're doing everything that you possibly can to find how many proselytes? Just one. It's like when Jesus told the story of the lost sheep or the lost coin. You're doing everything. Well, he said, you're doing the same thing, which is a good thing. But then immediately, what do? What he's saying there is you pull him in and you make him just like you are. And all the good that you could have done. Think about it this way. Somebody comes to church for the first time. And then they come for the second time and the third time. But you're sort of bringing him into your clique and you're giving him all the wrong things. Is that a positive? Is that going to be beneficial? Not if you're telling them and teaching them and dragging them into all the problems, all the troubles that maybe you are presenting as well. It would be a shame to think that somebody walked into this building and you said, don't go sit with Jimmy and Jill because it's just going to be, they're going to pull you down. That'd be bad, right? Do you think there are churches that have that problem? Probably so. I sometimes see kids move in, if somebody moves into school and they go sit by Jill and you're like, oh, that's a great move. Okay, that's a good person for them to be friends with. Or they go sit with somebody else, you're like, oh, probably going to be trouble, You can kind of see that. Well, what we see right here is him saying, you worked hard to get this person. And now you're dragging them down. Thoughts?
Usually when someone is brought in from outside, they're going to be more strict than the person.
Mm-hmm.
They had that alternate lifestyle, that alternate experience. It's like a kid getting ready by drill sergeant. Sometimes, they're going to be even more stricter than him, not every time.
Right.
Times. And it's just going to keep getting worse as you go down the line.
I like what Barry said a while ago too. If a lady came in this evening that we know was prostitute, we need to embrace her. Okay. We need to hug her.
Right.
Glad she's here. We need to treat her with respect and dignity. Maybe the first time in her life she's ever been treated.
Sure.
If
Sure.
you treat her like an outcast or somebody that's terrible, even though she's made bad decisions, we can't do that. We got to embrace her.
Sure.
That's what life comes from. Otherwise, we make it worse than before.
Mary.
I don't think we do that at Stanford, and I pray we never do.
Matthew 23. This is verses 16 through 22. Jill, since I said something bad about you, I'll let you read this. I don't know. That might be a punishment. I don't know. So. All right, so I want to say a couple things here before we get into our question. The word here, swears, and we're talking about like swearing an oath, is what the term here. And just a couple of things. The Jewish people, they couldn't swear an oath to God. They weren't allowed to swear an oath to God. Really weren't even allowed, I think Ben's talked about this before, weren't even allowed to say the name God. Weren't even allowed to pronounce that the way we would. And so what we see here is that they sort of will tiptoe around it just a little bit. The Pharisees had made a mockery, we would say, of oaths by making foolish distinctions regarding the sanctity of the objects in the oath. Let me give you an example here in just a second. Number one, if they swore by the temple, the oath was what? Okay, it's not binding. Okay, so if we swore by the temple, but if you swore by the gold in the temple, the oath was what? Binding. Yeah, you're right, Lucia. So what's the difference here? That's true. That's true. Others on that? We'll get to the second ones here in a second. Sure. Yeah. If they swore by the altar, the oath was what? It was not binding. But if they swore by the gift upon the altar, the oath was what? Binding. You talk about some tricky rules, right? You talk about some sort of hard things to grasp, hard to sort of consider. But all of this is a loophole that we've seen over and over again. The Pharisees had done this to the law. They had taken the law and they said, well, that's okay. That's not okay. Well, the altar is okay, but the stuff that's on it is more important. How are you going to keep up with all this? Well, why are they doing this? Why are they making these sort of nitpicking, binding, non-binding rules? You excuse your behavior right there. You get out of it what you need. Jesus says, one who swears by the altar swears by what in verse 20? What did he say in verse 20? He said, one who swears by the altar, what? Swears by it and all things that are on. He said, it's all the same right here. One who swears by the temple swears to what? Matthew 23 and verse 21. It and him who dwells in it right there. If one swears by heaven, he swears to what? Jesus, to dumb this down, he said, quit making these distinctions over these little things to try and skirt around the rules, to try and skirt around the laws, to try and get by with something here with him. Exactly. We read in the Bible to let our yes be what? And our no be no. Ben?
It puts me in the mentality of kids. If I'm double on there, then you got to. If I just dare you, then you ain't. To me, that's what it is. The people ain't child.
Right. Other thoughts? All right. Let's go to woe number 4. This is Matthew 23, verses 23 and 24. Annette, you want this one? This verse reminds me of a story, joke, whatever that Dad used to tell, that he said the hardest day was when at work was when they had to carry the styrofoam or whatever, but he was glad he'd missed the day they carried anvils or something along those lines. You ever known somebody, you're moving something and somebody's like, well, I've got the TV or something, old TVs, I've got the TV, and it's like, well, I've got this sheet of paper, we're really, I'm holding up my end of the deal right here as well. We're going to see that right here. It said the scribes and the Pharisees. We'll talk about these things here in a second. Scribes and the Pharisees were careful to tithe mint, anise, and cumin, but they neglected the more important matters of the law, which were what? Justice, mercy, and what was the other one? Faith. All right. These are the 3 things that Jesus mentions. Okay. Now, this is mint. Okay. This looks like a small sort of salad bowl, right? There's a lot of mint that's right there. And this is anise, which is also translated as dill. And then this is cumin. Okay. These are seasonings, right? These are things that you would use to season. These are not the biggest things, right? You can eat a meal and put this on it. It's going to make it better, right? But what's the main thing in the meal? These things or the actual thing that you're putting it on? Yeah, these are the garnishes. These are the additions that are put to it. And Jesus is saying, you are all together focused on these little things, but what are you doing to justice and mercy and faith? You are ignoring that. So I am 100% focused on this one thing and not so much on the other. We read they were blind guides. Jesus said, you strained at a what? And swallowed a what? What is that? I like this. That's an interesting comment. What does that mean? You strain at a gnat and you swallow a camel.
It's like these officers, they would go to the store and buy some men, or someone would give them some men. They would be real careful to get the scales out. They
Sure.
would around that 10% or whatever, make sure it's the exact thing. But then, like the other example, they would devour widows' houses.
Right.
Okay, you know, this house belongs to us, now we've given us, you get out.
Right. Right. She said she had a friend that said that the emphasis was on the wrong syllable. So instead of emphasis on the syllable, you're hitting the wrong thing. That's really good. Although I will say, strain at a gnat rings a little differently sometimes when you're mowing the lawn and something flies into your mouth. It can ring a little different from time to time. But getting all worked up about a gnat, but then not worrying about a camel at all is what Jesus is saying. This is a whatever the countrified version of people talking in Galilee was. This was the same. I guarantee you that this was a sentence that somebody had said to Jesus. This is something Jesus's mom had said when he was growing up, because that sounds like something a mom would say right there, that you strain at a gnat and you'll swallow a camel. I think we know what he's talking about right here when it comes to tithing, when it comes to giving, when it comes to helping, as Ben said. Thoughts on it?
Well, I used to see this all the time when people used to read newspapers, and people used to use the post office all the time. Stamps would go up 2 cents. Okay? And so most people mail $5 a month.
Right.
So that's 10 cents. No problem. House payments or car payments went from $100 to $200, $300, $400. And they would write 500 letters to the editor about stamps going up.
Right.
It cost you $10 more a month.
Right.
They died about it. People were just furiously mad because I worked post office. But they didn't mention house payments,
Right.
car payments, or interest rates, or anything like that. And I thought, you guys are straining at the neck.
Right. Sure.
Even if it broke 10 cents a month don't hurt you. It don't
Right.
hurt anybody.
Sure.
But those other big gigantic bills was what was the concern.
Right.
I thought of this every time that I read one of those letters. I thought, whoa.
Others on this. Matthew 23, verses 25 and 26. Let's see. Maria, you want to read this one? These next two are real similar. What we're going to see, verses 25 and 26, and then verses 27 and 28. The example is somewhat similar, but let's call this one washing. And it said the scribes and Pharisees carefully washed the outside of the cup and the platter, but inside they were full of what? Full of extortion and self-indulgence, right? How many of you have ever put something in the dishwasher and you take it out and it looks fine, but then on the inside you realize that coffee cup or whatever it is, like, ooh, that didn't get clean, right? Well, if you don't look on the inside of that cup, if you just look on the outside, what's it look like? It's great, but do you want to drink from that cup that's still dirty, or from that bowl that's still dirty there on the inside as well? No, we don't want to do that. Jesus said to clean the inside first. Then what would happen to the outside? Then it would be clean also. Okay? And it would be clean also. So let's get away from the dishwasher and get cleaning them by hand. When you wash a cup, what do you do with your hand, or a bowl when you're washing it by hand? You got to dig right in there, right? You're going to clean that out, and that water's running over it, and you're cleaning that whole thing. What is Jesus saying here when he says clean the inside first? It's the most important thing. Why is he telling the Pharisees this? Absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah. Right. Right. He said the inside, they were full of extortion and self-indulgence. That goes back to a little bit of what you said there a minute ago with claiming the houses and, making everything for themselves, but not for others. Like I said, this next one is similar to it. This is verse 27 and 28. Mom, do you care to read this one? Have you already read something? Oh, go ahead. All right. So we use the term, Jesus uses the term here, he compares them to whitewashed tombs. That's a book that I've been reading, and it has nothing to do with any of this, but it said that there was this building and it had been whitewashed, but it said it had been done 250 years ago, and you could now see the image that it had been covered over. When we think about whitewashing, sort of painting over something just a little bit, what's the purpose of painting over anything? It's to hide, to cover it up. You may have bought a house and the paint in the living room was just a bad color. You can't take that off, but you put something over it. You choose a different color to make it better. He compared the scribes and Pharisees to whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, right? A good paint job on a house or room or whatever makes it look nice. But he said these tombs look beautiful on the outside, but inside are what? Full an uncleanliness, yeah. It's full of bones and uncleanliness, yes.
Like you get a water stain, you go buy some kills, and you put over. You're not going to see that water stain anymore, but you ain't done anything to fix the leak.
Right.
That's what when you buy a house, that's what you're going to do. But that's what they are doing. They're just putting kills over to make it look good, but they still haven't fixed it.
Absolutely. And he said that we can make the grave, for example, that we can make the tombstone look pretty. We can clean the tombstone. But it's still the graves of, it's the bones of a body. There's nothing that can come from that. You can make it look nice, but it's not anything good that's with it. How does that comparison work with the scribes and Pharisees? This is kind of what Maria said there just a minute ago. It said they outwardly what? They outwardly appeared righteous. Some say beautiful, but inwardly were what? Full of hypocrisy and uncleanness, like Maria just said right there. So it can look good. So Jesus has sort of come back around to the same criticism. These are all the same criticism, right? It's all about inward and outward man that Jesus is making these criticisms of others. We got one more. Anybody want anything before we go to the last one? All right. This is a little bit longer of reading. Shelby, you want to read this and I'll click it forward.
What do you describe as Pharisees, hypocrites? Because you build the temples of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous and saints. If we lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers of dealing with blood of prophets. Therefore, you're witnessing yourself that your sons of those who murdered prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Search the root of others, after you escape the condemnation of hell. Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel and the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. For surely I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation.
All right. So there's a few things to look at here. First of all, we'll come back to a couple of things right here. But we read that the scribes and the Pharisees that honored these dead prophets by building monuments over their graves, by decorating the entrance to the tombs, which were dug out of rocks on the sides of the hills. And they said if they had lived in the days of their fathers, they would not have killed the prophets. And maybe they wouldn't have. But Jesus seems to not necessarily believe that. Jesus said, you are blank of them which killed the prophets. You are sons of them. You are the witnesses of those which killed the prophets. And in a sense, what is Jesus saying here? That's a pretty good way of saying it. The apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. What you're saying, all these people in your past that have done wrong, you're doing the same thing right now. He told him, he said, fill up then the blank of your father's what? Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. What does this mean?
I think it's like when he said the people in the promised land started going on course because now the guilt of the Amorites are not yet filled up.
Yeah.
And Jesus is telling them about murdering me and the ones that I'm going to be sending you, your iniquity is going to be filled up and God's going to come and wreak just vengeance on Jerusalem.
Uh-huh. Others?
Jesus will say here, not many days after this, people will say, his blood be on us and on our children. We're not changing. We hated him then, we hate him now, and we don't care for killing him. Who gets blamed?
Sure.
Our fathers or us or even our kids. We want him dead.
Yeah.
That Jesus knows.
Yeah.
He knows the fact.
I think he's saying right here, yeah, you finish the job. Your fathers did it. They've killed them, and you're doing the same thing. And here in a few days, you're going to finish the job here as well. When would all of these things come to pass? He said, upon that generation. So this is not something that in the future, down the line, your great grandkids will. He said, upon this generation. I want to go back real quick, though. I like the literary aspect of what he says here. He says, you are responsible for all the blood shed on the earth, the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah. Why do you think he chose those two names? It's A to Z, right? In a sense, what he's saying is from the beginning to the end, you fill the whole thing in. And I don't know if that's exactly how it would translate in the language that Jesus was using right there, but that's how we would interpret it. You've filled you've done it all from A to Z right there. I think that's it for tonight. Anybody? Oh, no. So a few things here. This is just sort of to wrap it up. This is not anything that you haven't already maybe said tonight, but he concludes this condemnation with what Ben read there at the start, at the beginning of the service, is that he said that he would have gathered them as a hen gathers her chickens under his wings, what Jesus said. He's saying to the Pharisees, at any time, you can come over to my side, for lack of a better word. And he said, just like a hen would gather every one of them. And if you see a hen like that, they don't look that big, but they stretch those wings out and they can get a million little chicks underneath them, right? He said, I would have gathered you all in, but you were not willing. Therefore, their house was left unto them desolate. And these were dire warnings of the leaders of religious leaders of the day. But we said that, and I think Ben said that just a minute ago. It's the same warning for us today. It is the exact same warning. We are called to true godliness. Well, I don't know that we can ever get there, but we should strive for it, right? We are called to sincere love, not loving you because you can put a few extra dollars in the plate on Sunday morning, but sincere love and an enduring faith, not one that just gives way whenever times are tough, or on the flip side, putting, like the Pharisees had done there, kind of making themselves look good on the outside, but not doing anything on the inside there as well. And as the last thing that I wrote up there, it says, attempting to impress with behaviors and actions that are in truth hypocritical will only lead to woe, because it'll eventually catch up. Anybody else with anything before we stop this evening?
I think the whole thing behind it doesn't matter how you act, how people see you, how you act. It's what's on the inside of you, and you can't hide that. God knows everything. Just like when everything he told them, you acted like this, but I know you're really like this. And I think that's, you need to be what you are, because you can't hide.
Anybody else? All right. Well, next week we will talk about the separating of the sheep and the goats. I don't think you pronounce it sheeps, do you? That's not right. All right, we'll do that next week. Thank you all for your participation.